Hello and welcome to The Urbanist, Monocle's programme all about the built environment. I'm your host, Andrew Tuck. Coming up.
We have to keep building. That's the bigger issue we have to face right now. And there's an opportunity where the amount of households that have been formed over the last few years relative to the amount of housing stock being produced, there's a huge deficit there. We're only building 40,000 houses a year, but we're bringing in hundreds of thousands of people a year.
As Canadians prepare to make their voices heard at the polls this week, we take a look at how the urban environment has made its way onto the ballot. We explore how the national housing shortage has entered the debate, assess how Canadian cities have responded to tariffs from the United States, and we explore the new developments planned for Toronto's Downsview Airport too. That's all ahead in the next 30 minutes, right here on The Urbanist, with me, Andrew Tuck. Welcome to today's episode. Canadians are heading to the polls next week on April 28th to elect members of the House of Commons for the 45th Canadian Parliament. We want to take this moment to explore how this federal election will impact Canadian cities and what has been going on in the lead up to the big day at the polls. Well, housing is among the big issues that are on the ballot come election day, and with a national housing shortage and rising cost of living, it's never been more critical to ensure speed to market for the attainable homes. Monocle's contributing editor, Sheena Ruster, sent us this report to explain how federal politics and the economy are largely dictating the current urban landscape.
It's been an unavoidable part of daily life in Canada so far this year. Politics.
I've just requested that the Governor-General dissolve Parliament and call an election for April 28th.
Just 9 days after being sworn in as Prime Minister, Mark Carney stood at a wooden lectern that donned a chisel maple leaf on the steps of Rideau Hall, the official residence of the Governor-General of Canada. His call for a snap election is another move in what's been a turbulent 2025 in the world of Canadian politics.
We are facing the most significant crisis of our lifetimes because of President Trump's unjustified trade actions and his threats to our sovereignty. Our response must be to build a strong economy and a more secure Canada.
Carney is unelected. In recent history, the last time there was an unelected Prime Minister in Canada was John Turner in 1984. This snap election call is seen as a way to get more stability in Canadian politics, regardless of which party will hold power. Canada's Parliament has been prorogued since former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau resigned in early January, and with the cost of living and the current housing crisis being top issues on the ballot, Canadians across the country are eager for policies to be put into action.
We're going to get some dinner started here in a couple of minutes.
So how pressing is this issue for home and city builders?
We've got a pretty dynamic couple of speakers here who have traveled great and short distances to be with us tonight to talk about the future of the economy in our city in Alberta.
Both home and city builders sit down for a banquet dinner in downtown Edmonton. They're all gathered here to get the forecast of the economy and what that means for building desperately needed homes. Well before the start of the year, there has been a housing crisis in full effect. There is currently a shortfall of 3.1 million homes across the country. Nearly half of Canadians report being very concerned about housing affordability because of the rising cost of housing or rent. That's according to Statistics Canada. There are several factors that play into this crisis. A labor shortage is partly to blame, but the discrepancy of how many people would be living in Canada this year didn't help developers and planners when it came to planning cities. Stéphane Marion is the chief economist at the National Bank of Canada, and he explains more.
We've added 3 million Canadians in 3 years in the country. You normally do this over a span of 8 to 10 years, but we haven't built an industrial sector to cope with the increase in population, which forces us to be overly dependent on the rest of the world for some of the products that we need to consume in our country. And I think the manufacturing sector should offer hope that we can redefine our country in order not to jeopardize our economic sovereignty, which is under threat at this point in time. So it's a wake-up moment, I think, for policymakers.
Many newcomers arrived on Canadian soil, and life hasn't been what they imagined it to be. This has led to some new arrivals in the country to return back home. As Stéphane Marion explains, not all aspects of life were looked at when this immigration policy was created.
Well, we broke our social contract when we ran an immigration policy that was very aggressive without building the infrastructure that needed to come with it. So basically we're saying we're trying to poach foreign talent, which is very important for our future economic growth. But you can't find a family doctor, unable to find daycare, try to find a place in school. This is the issue where we brought the people but forgot to build the infrastructure. So by breaking this social contract, I think there will be an overhang. We will pay a price for that. How big a price, we'll see. But certainly some people are frustrated to see that you invited me to your country. I want to be productive, but I can't be productive because you don't even have those key infrastructure. The lifestyle is a whole package. So this is where there was some failure in the immigration policy.
And this population increase is a major pressure point for housing right now. Here's Paul Lanny, president and CEO of Averton, a real estate developer with operations in both Toronto and Edmonton.
The rise in population, the sheer number of houses that are in demand right now is really making this issue larger than it's ever been. We know in conversations with the province that they've made it a priority for the province of Alberta, recently stating that we are 100,000 homes short of what we need just right now, let alone the growth that continues to happen. Alberta, as an individual jurisdiction, has grown 4.4%, which is the largest in the world, fastest growth in the world. So with that growth, we need housing. We have not built enough housing for the amount of people that have arrived in this province.
Densifying is key. Being able to adapt to higher density is just part of the maturation of a city, says Paul.
Because we have a fixed amount of labor, building less dense housing uses up that labor less efficiently. Put simply, if you're swinging a hammer building a single house or you're swinging a hammer building an 8-plex of row housing, for example, you're creating that much more housing. We're exploring different built forms that get us a greater yield per acre. That's all going to help because where traditionally we might have built one house, we might be able to build multiple. And I think that's going to create solutions for families, for new arrivals in the province and across the country.
For Paul Lanny, regardless of the election outcome here in Canada or tariffs being imposed by the United States, creating more homes for people to live in, be it newcomers or otherwise, has to remain a priority as Canadian cities continue to grow. Canada's housing crisis will need to be solved regardless of trade wars.
We have to keep building. That's the bigger issue we have to face right now. And there's an opportunity where the amount of households that have been formed over the last few years relative to the amount of housing stock being produced, there's a huge deficit there. We're only building 40,000 houses a year, but we're bringing in hundreds of thousands of people a year.
For Monocle Radio in Edmonton, I'm Sheena Rossiter.
We look now to the reaction that Canada has had to the US president's sweeping tariffs since entering the Oval Office and how that reaction has played out in Canadian cities. And I'm joined now by Monocle's Toronto correspondent, Thomas Lewis. Thomas, thank you for joining us. Now, before we came on air, we just discussed we sent you to Toronto as a Monocle employee to run the bureau. You've been there a decade now, so you speak with some authority on this topic, I believe.
Well, I try my best, Andrew. I'm not sure if my Torontonian friends would agree with you there, but I do try. But yes, it's 10 years has flown by. It's pretty hard to believe all that time has gone so quickly.
Now, these tariffs have had the effect of encouraging citizens north of the border to buy Canadian. Are you seeing this among your friends and people you know?
I am actually. And, these spaces on the sort of grocery shelves, Andrew, are pretty remarkable. And I think what a lot of my Canadian friends who are sort of born and raised Canadians, the things that's really struck them about all this is just how sort of galvanizing it's been and how unified the sentiment in the public has been. One of my friends was saying, who's from Vancouver originally, he was saying the last time he could remember Canada feeling so unified and kind of on the same page, if you like, was when Vancouver hosted the Winter Olympic Games back in 2010. Obviously a pretty different occasion to the uncertainty that's been caused over the past few weeks here. But I think it kind of shows you maybe how rare this kind of unified sentiment in Canada is. And I think initially, there was a real shock to kind of that this was actually going through. And obviously it's been a bit of an on again, off again situation in terms of tariffs. But I think the fact that this sort of anger has really bedded in, and maybe we'll discuss this a little later, Andrew, but you are seeing that I think people wanted to show their discontent to start with, but I think we are kind of seeing habits change and started to embed in a different way that doesn't involve the US, which I think even a few weeks ago would have been pretty remarkable to think, given how long the history, the relationship, how intertwined the economies are. There are people who live in border cities and border towns. Some of them will live in Canadian cities and go across the border to work in the US and then come home again at the end of the day. It's a really intertwined relationship, and that's really been ruptured. And I think it will be interesting to see how deeply and how long term, even if, for example, the economic policy changes from the US's point of view towards Canada, just emotionally, how deeply this will remain and how people kind of maybe won't forget, I think, kind of quickly. I think that'll be an interesting thing to look out for in the long term, Andrew.
Yes, of course, because he's not just talking about tariffs with Canada. He's suggested you should become the 51st state. There is no real nationhood or sense of being Canadian. You're just kind of Americans who forgot to join the union. But just tell me, when you look at cities, what signs are you seeing of this dislocation?
Well, I think it was interesting, Andrew, when this all began at the beginning of February, we saw a lot of cities making moves to sort of give their initial kind of pushback against these manoeuvres that President Trump is making against Canada's economy. But then when the tariffs were rolled back sort of initially, then we saw a lot of these moves. So, for example, cities cancelling contracts with Starlink, for example, Elon Musk's satellite internet company. And then when they came back again, things became a lot more entrenched. So that's when we saw these decrees, if you like, kind of banning the sale of American alcohol, for example, from the big retailers here in Ontario. And that was significant because the Liquor Control Board of Ontario, the LCBO, sort of alcohol shops, they are among one of the biggest buyers, government buyers of alcohol anywhere in the world. And, we're still seeing that sort of ban in place, if you like, on American alcohol being sold in those shops. And it's a similar picture in other cities across Canada as well. I was speaking, Andrew, to one of the main news anchors of the big CBC, the public broadcaster's nightly newscast, Adrienne Arsenault, last week. And she was in a small city in Atlantic Canada. She was reporting there because there's an election underway, of course. And she was saying that there is, in the centre of that city, there are lots of flags internationally. It's a big cruise port, so lots of American tourists visit there. And just before she'd arrived, they'd taken the American flag down. And we've seen this in other Canadian cities as well. And she was saying it might seem like a small thing, but actually it does show just how profoundly people feel or cities feel. And of course, city governments have to react in a certain way to the public mood. And the public mood is pretty pronounced and pretty clear at the moment. And she was saying, you may have missed it if you'd never been to St. John in New Brunswick before, this city, which also has a deep water port. So lots of exports go to the US from there as well, that you may have missed it. But actually it felt like quite a profound thing to residents in the city there, as it has in other cities, bigger cities across Canada too. And I think, people are really kind of angry, actually. And I think people feel quite incensed in lots of ways by the fact that they're being treated in this way. And we've heard a lot of, going back through history about the times that Canadian cities or Canadian towns have rallied to help the US over the years, and how they feel sort of a bit betrayed by that. And I think, the Prime Minister, Mark Carney, put it fairly sort of eloquently. And he said, Canadians may have got over the shock of the betrayal, but we must never forget the lessons that we're learning. I'm paraphrasing there slightly, but I think it is quite an eloquent way of putting the fact that things do feel as though they've changed pretty profoundly. And cities in many ways are kind of leading the charge in that and have been quite nimble in, as I said, sort of barring American companies from government contracts, taking American flags down, which is the most visible part of this, obviously. But, the things behind the scenes in order to sort of focus back on what Canadian manufacturers, what manufacturing hubs in cities kind of can do and what they might be able to look like as this relationship is recalibrating, if you like. So, yes, it does feel quite profound. And I do feel that the cities right across the country are taking pretty their own stands in many ways, fitting in with the sort of the national message that we're getting. But it does feel as though they are taking the initiative to meet the public mood of the residents in their cities as well.
Thomas, tell me, in your home city of Toronto, Mayor Chow has been outspoken. I saw the other day, she said that this rupture that's happened may not heal for a generation. It's that deep.
It is deep, and I think it's interesting, Andrew, having spent lots of time in the US as well, I feel as though perhaps some of the news coverage of just how profoundly Canadian cities or, the public at large, how just profoundly they feel about what's been going on, hasn't maybe really sort of made it in the most extensive way in the US media. So I think the fact, we've seen in sports stadiums the American anthem being booed, for example, I think these things have come as quite a surprise. And I think in a way, Andrew, they've become a bit of a surprise to Canadians too. Like they're not really a population that likes to boo sort of other countries' anthems and things. But, it's a small sort of symbol of just how profoundly things have changed. And I think what will be interesting to see now is how city governments keep this momentum going, if you like. We've heard again from the Prime Minister, Mark Carney, saying that, he wants to sort of overhaul Canada's economy, so it isn't so dependent on the United States and that it can be its own sort of economic superpower. And cities will have a big part to play in that. So I think it will be interesting to see how they put those policies into action in the longer term, even after, for example, when President Trump's term in office comes to an end, just how they will seize this kind of moment that feels really like a big moment of change. And I think that's how we'll see, I suppose, longer term, Andrew, how cities and maybe the country at large have transformed, given that this changed the relationship, this very old relationship, really does feel so profound at the moment.
And just lastly, while we're on this topic, just tell me about the border town issue, because as you said, in many of these places, they're used to trading with people back and forth, people commuting for work. There it's harder to kind of break, I guess, some of these relationships. But are you seeing in the Canadian media that there is also here an attempt to disconnect or at least to stand back a little bit from the fray?
I think, in a way, lots of these border cities, Andrew, maybe are feeling it more profoundly. So the city of Windsor is just across the river from Detroit, and those two cities have a very intertwined history. And actually later this year, one of the biggest sort of transport infrastructure links between the two countries, a new international bridge linking the two cities, is scheduled to open. And that was going to be this big symbol of boosting the relationship, boosting the ability of trucks to go across the bridges, to go into the US, to come back into Canada. And of course, that might become a symbol, I think, of a time gone by almost, possibly, when it is opened in September, is what we're expecting. So yes, I think the residents of these cities, in a way, on the Canadian side of the border, are feeling this swell of patriotism kind of most keenly, I think. But of course, it does kind of grind against the reality that their lives, daily lives, their jobs, their families, are cross-border and have been for so long. So there are some quite profound sort of conversations, I think, happening, if these trade barriers do continue long term, what that might mean for them.
Well, Thomas, thank you for that excellent roundup. So 10 years of being in Canada, you speak with the authority of a local. But while I have you, I also wanted to ask about another local project in your home city of Toronto that's got nothing to do with your neighbours south of the border, the Downsview airport development. Can you just give us a bit of a background to this project and perhaps introduce the interview that you now have for us with the team?
Yeah, it's an amazing project, actually, Andrew, and it's a very long-term one over the next 30 years. A former airport, Downsview Airport, which I believe is the geographic centre of the city. So there's kind of a nice sort of symbolism to that about sort of rejuvenating and redeveloping this strategic point in the city's geography. But this airport for many years, had kind of quite a storied place in the city in the sort of later incarnations. The Pope gave a mass there. I think the Rolling Stones may have performed there as well. But when its tenant, Bombardier, and we actually covered its new facility near Toronto Pearson International Airport here, when they vacated it, it's now going to be transformed into a series of neighbourhoods. And I think what I was struck by as a lovely sort of feature of this is that the runway itself will form the main artery through all of these neighbourhoods, so that history will still be sort of a living part of these new communities as they take shape. And I did go and pay a visit, as you mentioned, Andrew, and I went to speak to some of the team. It was a pretty blustery and pretty chilly day when we went, but it was great to get a sense of the scale of what's going to be taking shape there over the next 30 years.
This is a part of town that is underserviced and there hasn't been that level of investment. And in a diverse city, this is one of the most diverse places in the city. A lot of people who come here, this is an area that they live in and work in because it's an area that they can afford. So I think that, there's just a ton of potential here to do so much and address so many of the city's issues. And I think all cities are going through this, but, the housing issue, making sure that we're training that next generation to be able to get the jobs of the future, and then providing just basic amenities for people that really don't exist right now. So 2031 is sort of when we're anticipating that this district will be complete. People will be living, and we'll be able to have people working here before that. The employment uses are as of right here. Plus, if somebody just came in and said, okay, we'd like to take the hangars to do film production for the next 5 years, that's easy enough to do. We just have the ability to do something entirely different because of the size of this place. I think the defining feature here is that aerospace history we talked about. There are very few buildings on our lands, but we are preserving these hangars, which are these magnificent buildings, which we'll show you. So we'll keep those buildings. We'll be building a bunch of new residential down here, some mixed use. And then the other thing from an aerospace perspective that we're keeping, which really is, one of the most exciting things about this, is the runway, which we'll get out to later, which is in yellow here. So again, more than 2 kilometers long. We'll be preserving that, not in its existing form, but we'll be turning it into a, more than 2 kilometer long pedestrianized boulevard. The best way, I think, to look at it, it's really our version of the High Line, but bigger, longer, and better. When I say better, I mean there'll be different rooms as you go along. So, one area might be, passive parks. The next would be performance spaces. The next would be sort of recreation themed, or there'd be playgrounds. But it's really the connective tissue for all the new neighborhoods that are being built here. And it's something we don't have in Toronto. And really, it's something that's, I think, unique in the world.
And it's so cool because I guess it would be very tempting to have a plot this big and sort of, start totally from scratch and kind of have something that, maybe didn't nod to what the land was used for before. And that's so cool to have that as the through line.
And that's why we call it YZD, or that's how we came with the name. We've been doing more than 3 years of engagement. Before we even had a development application in, we were talking to people in the surrounding area. And, the one thing that came through is wanting to preserve the site's history and legacy. And so when we were coming up with the name, which is never an easy thing to do because, very often it can just feel very inauthentic or made up or whatever. But YZD is the airport call sign, or has been for, I don't think they had them 100 years ago, but they, more recently. And it's unusual, but I think it really speaks to, again, the more recent history and, the elements that we're trying to preserve that makes this a unique place. And that's what we're really in the business of doing at Northcrest, is creating a new place. It's not just, we're not just building a couple of condo buildings and even a neighborhood. We're building a new piece of city. It's going to be on our lands, 35,000 roughly new housing units, about 25,000 people working So you're looking at about 80,000 people living and working just on our lands. It's 120,000 when you factor in Canada lands. So that's a city the size of Kingston or Guelph on this footprint.
So transformative, really, in lots of different ways.
It is. I don't think we're exaggerating when we say it's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, urban redevelopment projects in North America. And to us, it's so exciting. Having a singular owner, PSP, who's long-term in their thinking, has patient capital, has a long-term investment horizon, just allows you to do things you ordinarily wouldn't be able to do in development. They will be the owner for, as I say, as long as, decades. And that just allows them to do things differently. But I think the most important thing is this vision that we've come up with, talking to the local community, to stakeholders from across the city and the region with our Indigenous partners. It allows them to make sure that that vision actually comes to pass. Is it going to be exactly what we laid out in, all the books and the literature that we produce? No, but it'll be, more or less, plus or minus 5% of the overall vision for the site. And that doesn't often happen, right? You often see these things sort of get talked about and then it's drastically different from what was promised. And again, I'm not saying that it'll be exact, but it'll be pretty darn close. So, about 80,000 square feet, about 25 feet clear span. They had, when they were manufacturing airplanes in here, you could fit 7 jets in here. And so they really are spaces unlike anything we've got in the city, heated, climate controlled. You can see how flexible they are in terms of, you can separate them, you can make them one big space, or you can demise them. You can build, mezzanine level floors. So you have office, the potential to have office, coming out as far as you want, but we've had everything from, we had Oktoberfest, the beer festival in here. We've had film productions, anything that requires just big open spaces. But you could also turn them into creative office. You could, retrofit them and, they have that incredible kind of flexibility and adaptability to whatever you want to do in here.
And you were saying that when it'll be finally set in stone, kind of what these hangars will be, is still kind of, you're still weighing sort of the options and things. Is it nice to have that flexibility for
Yeah, absolutely. And because I think that's going to be the, for lack of a better term, secret sauce here, is that you want a mix of uses. You don't want to go sort of too far down one road only to then try to sort of reverse course or do something a little bit different. So I think the game plan is to try to be as flexible as possible. And that's why things like creative uses or even advanced manufacturing or more modern manufacturing, where it's not things bolted into the ground. They're literally sort of wheeling in machines and then they're able to wheel them out. But you could even, break it up into really small maker spaces, maybe 2,000, 3,000 square feet. And you could have 10 of those, then next to a production set. So I think having that mix is, as I say, building that sort of ecosystem around creative industries, lab spaces, maker spaces. But it is about making stuff. I don't think it'll ever be, a place where you have a lot of software engineers. I think people will come here to make stuff. Again, whether that's film, whether that's actual things, the next generation of batteries, the next generation of solar panels, modular homes. That's like one thing that I'm particularly excited about is, we're seeing massive advances in modular construction. We will have a lot of, very sort of, we're building a lot of residential, as you know. So there is the potential that you could actually make the homes in here, which is maybe a weird sounding thing because you don't think of mass producing homes, but that is where the industry is going. You make them here and you literally ship them next door. And the housing will reflect that as well, too. We're going to do more family-sized units than you would typically see in a development like this. We're going to do more affordable housing than you would typically see in a development like this.
Well, that was fascinating, Thomas. Thank you so much for joining us from Toronto. And here's hoping that all goes well with what's happening down on the border. Thank you, Thomas.
I'll keep you posted, Andrew. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And that's all for this week's episode of The Urbanist. You can follow us for new editions of the show every week, and you can subscribe to Monocle magazine for reports on all things design, architecture and urbanism too. Just visit monocle.com. The Urbanist is produced by Carlotta Rebello and by David Stevens, who also edits the show. I'm Andrew Tuck. Goodbye, and thank you for listening, City Lovers.